Welcome to Interpreting Wine's first ever series looking at the category of port. This series will bust a lot of myths about this often misunderstood beverage, discussing the history and evolution of the style, a tasting of representative styles, and an in-depth conversation with a world-famous producer. If you've ever wanted to deepen your knowledge about the world of port, then do listen on. And if you'd either like to listen to the whole series or share this series with a friend, do head to interpretingwine.com/port19. Today's episode of the Port series features Dia Grigoriou, the Wine Mojo, giving us an introduction to the world of port. We hear Dia's origin story and how this category has captivated her, before hearing a potted history of port, and she goes in depth into port categorisation. Enjoy.
My wine career started in Greece, and that was back in 1999. It was one of those things, finishing school, not knowing what to do. Then I've been notified of this vocational training that the Greek government had sort of installed, and it was one of the subjects was vine culture and enology. Okay, so I looked at a lot of other things. There were computers there and all that, like IT, and I'm like, oh, vine training and enology. I thought that was really interesting. So that's how it started. I did 3 years there, finished my course, took my exams, got my diploma. Then I worked a bit in the wine trade, just for did a harvest and winemaking for about 6-7 months. Following that, I was quite young actually. Wine hadn't really sunk in, as it happens most of the time. And later on, though, I did try to search it a bit further on the commercial side, and then did some seminars, and I was lucky enough to be chosen to go and work for one of the first masters of wine in Greece, Konstantinos Lazarakis, and he has an equivalent to WSET education platform in Greece. So what I did at the time was setting up glasses, serving for the people that were taking all the WSET courses, and through that I was given, a WSET Level 1 course. And that opened, apart from the winemaking, a new horizon on the commercial side of things. Following that, I worked a bit in some wine shops in Greece. In Wine Garage was an amazing shop where it had a variety of wines from all over the world. And following that, I came to the UK. That was about 7 years ago. And that's where port started for me, because I was really lucky to start working for a company called Vintage Wine and Port. They're based in Hampshire, in Fordingbridge, and we kind of specialise in port, but specifically in very old vintages. The love of port started there. I really started studying a lot about it. I personally did personal tastings and went into events where very specific to port. I have a very sweet tooth. Therefore, I really, really enjoy drinking port, and I could not stop learning more about it. And in all honesty, I know enough, but not yet enough, And yes, that's me. Been working there for 7 years, and I travel to Portugal at least once a year. Go up in the Douro Valley to learn more about the processes of winemaking, viticulture there, and also try a lot of port with the producers as well.
It's great to hear that story kind of all in one go. I mean, we've known each other for a little while now, met when I was living down in Southampton, and, do remember you being one of those people that really helped me at the start. Your enthusiasm was super contagious, and from what we can hear there, obviously a great passion of yours. So I thought, who better to kind of give me and give the listeners a kind of a potted history, I guess, of port. I think it's one of those subjects that I personally can feel a bit overwhelmed by. If I've done reading about it and studying about it, I haven't necessarily remembered all of the terms, and it's not so easy for me to explain it to somebody else. So I'm hoping you can do a better job for us today.
Okay then, so port, winemaking, let's say, in Portugal started in the 2nd century BC when the Romans went there and they brought all their knowledge with them on how to cultivate vines and produce wine. They've done that for the next 500 years, which was the time that they remained there as well. Then later on, in 1174, is where the Kingdom of Portugal was established. And wine, obviously, since they had the knowledge up to then, became a quite considerable expert. Later on, in 1386, let's move through the centuries as well, one of the important things that happened in the port trade, let's say the wine trade, because port wasn't even created then, okay, was that Portugal and England signed a treaty to create and establish commercial relationships. Okay, so that's how wine movement started, due to the fact that also Portugal is quite close to the Atlantic, so they had the ships and they could transfer goods freely. Okay, then in 1667, move a few centuries later, something happened outside Portugal that actually had an impact in the Portuguese trade. Okay, and what was it? Was the back in the day, England and France had these commercial relationships as well. However, around the 1667, the first minister of France, of Louis XIV of France, took a series of measures to restrict English imports. Okay, to France. Then in England, Charles II replied by increasing the duty on French wine, which was really, the English back then loved fresh wine for its depth of flavour and richness. And therefore, they sort of increased their duty, and eventually they banned wine imports from France altogether. Now, this chance was grasped by a lot of English people that were residing in Portugal at the time. And a lot of the English merchants there, apart from like shipping goods all over the world, they had established a lot of textile businesses, okay? They found a chance to start promoting the Portuguese wine to the UK and the England especially, okay? So it was both a combination of the English seeking alternatives in terms of wine, of good quality wine. Obviously, the English merchants residing in Portugal wanted to export the goods, and that's how their relationship started. And then we come a bit further and how port was created, because port is a fortified wine. And what we mean with fortify, we mean that a spirit, a grape spirit, is added to the wine to increase its alcohol content, okay? But that happened only for a necessity at the time, only because the wines, the dry wines that were made in the Douro could not withstand the long sea journey, okay? So what was decided was to fortify them with grape spirit after the maturation and after when the wine was dry. So basically the port that we know today, that it's a sweeter style, is totally different with the fortification that used to happen back in the 1700s, okay? So what happened then was the wine was made dry, alcohol, then grape spirit was added to preserve it for the long journey, okay? Now, the first reference of port wine came a bit later, and that was 1678, okay? The wine was named port because it was shipped through boats from the river Douro, from the Douro Valley, coming down to the city of Oporto, where the humid climate was ideal for the aging of the wine. Okay, therefore, since it was shipped from Oporto, it was named Oporto wine. Therefore, port. Okay, and English more sense. Okay. That's about port. Later on, in the 1800s, that's where port started becoming sweeter. And that came about because, like most styles are created in the wine industry, is because of the demand. So people at the time liked sweeter wines, liqueur wines, Therefore, the fortification started happening a bit earlier and not after the wine was fully becoming dry after fermentation. Therefore, they started fortifying the wine early, during fermentation, and what happened, that killed off the yeast, and therefore what remained was a very sweet style. Okay, that we know and we love today, with a very nice alcoholic strength. But also, another reason why they fortified also earlier was to have a better integration of the alcohol when the port would later go into the barrel as well, and create a very, very flavoursome, very well integrated alcoholic drink.
Okay.
Another thing that we would like to mention about Portugal and the Douro, it's really important. So before even the Bordeaux classification, the vineyards of the Douro were classified, and that was like in the 1700s, okay? So it was well before everybody else start creating appellations of origin and classifying vineyards according to quality. So they were quite the pioneers on that. So they gave, the go-ahead to other wine regions to establish, an appellation system.
This is brilliant. I mean, I'm so happy to be able to do a deep dive into port. I haven't featured port on the podcast yet. So we're going to correct that today. And I think where I'd like to guide you now is towards the classifications, because I know that's something, again, that I can struggle to remember and I can struggle to explain. So maybe that will bring us more up to date now, where, you're introducing the different styles, and why they got their name, and how they enjoy their success over time.
Okay, let's start with the ruby style. So the ruby is like a category that encompasses little styles within the category. I know that's very hard to understand about port. Sometimes it would be even better to visualize this and see the categories. Ruby, as the name refers, it's all down to color. Okay, a ruby port, and a basic ruby port is a port from red grapes that has been not matured very much, and it's ready to drink for its freshness. It is sweet, and it has raspberry, strawberry, and these kind of elements there. It's very easy drink, okay. Then we go to the tawny. Tawny, again, as the name implies, it came about because of its colour. All tawnies began as a ruby, okay, but what's made the change and to alter their colour is barrel aging and oxidative aging. So they spent a lot of time in the barrel. That slowly reduced their colour. The oxygen has made the colour towards more a tawny, okay, paler, maybe like a more of a caramel sort of style. And due to the fact that they spent so much in the barrel, they've taken these kind of oxidative characteristics. Caramel, nuts, there's some dried figs, and elements. So these are the two main categories, but I should talk a bit about white port, which is a category on its own, okay? White port was actually initiated in 1930s from the Taylor's brand, and one of the famous white ports is called the chip dry, and white port can start from dry and get into sweet. So in contrast with the rest of the ports, which are mainly sweet, it's the only one that can actually start off as a dry. Okay, so it has different levels there. So it's and then that encompasses other different subcategories, which we'll discuss a bit later when we have a little taster. Okay, I should also mention rosé port. Another it's a very new development. So it started in 2008. Okay, it is in line with the need for rosé wines all over the world. As we spoke about earlier, the consumer is the person that creates styles in the wine industry. And the more the consumers prefer rosé wines, the port industry had to keep up and create this style. It's absolutely lovely and refreshing. It's a sweet port, okay, raspberry flavors, very light. It's made similar to a rosé production, so a little bit of contact with the grape skins to just get a little bit of the color, but mainly gets the fresh flavors of the grape. I brought something here for you to understand a bit more. So because we started with the white and said what's the flavor, okay, vintage port is basically a very compact, rich ruby that has had extensive maceration of the skins to get a lot of that color, a lot of the flavor, in contrast to the basic ruby style where it has more strawberry, raspberry, and a little blackberry sort of thing. The vintage is very intense. It's blackberry, licorice, but also it gets into the jammy flavors. Okay, so it has like blackberry jam. Sometimes vintage ports will reveal some very lovely violet. Some floral notes there, but also it will have extreme tannins, extremely rich, and then it starts off as a very, very dark, deep ruby wine, okay, and because it's actually vintage port is only aged for a couple of years in the barrel. Okay, and actually the barrel is very big, so we don't want a lot of oxidation there. Exactly, we don't want to alter the freshness, the fruitiness of what and the deep fruit content. But what we want to do is keep it fresh and then keep all the rich elements, keep as much tannins as we can, as much as the acidity as we can, hence the grape varieties that make this style as well. They all have very high acidity, deep colour, lots of tannins, to preserve the wine and to slowly keep it going for many years to come. So, therefore, as we say, vintage is a wine from a single year, okay? You can only call it a vintage because from a single harvest. Okay, a vintage port, a classic vintage port, as it's called, is only declared 3 times in a decade. And when we say declared, it means that all the winemakers of the Douro, the port shippers, alongside with the IVDP, which is the body that controls the production of port and the quality of port, gather together. They send the samples to the IVDP, they taste and they say, 2016, for example, was a fantastic year. The weather was excellent. There was no rain at harvest. The grapes are healthy, beautiful, and they've made such a deep flavored and rich port that is of a vintage port quality. Therefore, we unanimously will declare this vintage. Okay, that happens not many times in a decade. Okay, so we can't always have a good weather. Weather is variable in most wine regions, as we know. Okay, and port is one of these regions. And it would be nice to talk a bit later about how dramatic that region is and what makes the ports as well. Okay, and that is a vintage. Within that style?
Yeah.
Do you want to know more?
That's it, yeah. Let's do it. Let's go.
Okay. Within the vintage style, we have a single quinta vintage port. Okay, so that is actually, as it implies, a single quinta in Portuguese means vineyard. So it's a single vineyard vintage port. Single quintas can be produced pretty much every year. And what it is, single quintas form the backbone of a vintage port producer's range when there's not a declaration. Okay, so let's say 2014 was not a declared year, so some producers created a single quinta. Okay, 2015 was not a declared year, so for instance, they have a Quinta de Vesuvio 2015 from a single vineyard port. Okay, so it's a equally very good, but not up to the uppermost standards that would deem it of a classic vintage. Therefore, they still make a vintage port. It is considered as a vintage port, but it's just whereas a classic vintage would last 50 years or more in the bottle, a single Quinta may last 30, 35. Okay. Very important to say that these wines, before they're bottled, are not fined or filtered. Therefore, we have this sort of heavy deposit that forms in the bottle later on as the years go by. So this actually pretty much alive. All the alive elements that used to take part in the winemaking are the elements that shape the evolution of the vintage port in the bottle. So they're the ones that will remove the color slowly, and all these elements will, the color pigments will bind onto them, they'll fall at the bottom, and hence that's where a vintage port starts really dark, and later on in life it actually becomes a more of a tawny, lighter style, although you can't really call it a tawny, maybe a garnet, okay, a garnet color, because all of the color pigments slowly gather at the bottom, and that's why you really have to decant a vintage port. Okay, it's really necessary. LBV, again, late bottled vintage, as it's called. It is a port that starts off its life pretty similar to a vintage port. Unfortunately, it's not deemed of the quality of vintage port, it's not deemed of the quality of a single Quinta vintage port, and therefore the producer will not obviously waste his crop. They will use it to make this style called late bottled vintage. Normally LBV comes in two styles, filtered and unfiltered, but mainly here we'll find the filtered style. But what it does, it's actually the port goes into barrel aging for about 4 to 7 years. Okay. And that makes it more approachable in its youth, okay? Ready to drink now. You'll see the difference of an LBV. You can see the barrel aging when you try it, because on the rim of the glass, you'll see it has a bit of a garnet rim. So that shows that it had some time in the barrel. These wines are not harsh. They're ready to drink now. Open and pour. Do not need decanting. A very approachable young port. Obviously, there are LBVs that are unfiltered as well. This will actually be mentioned on the bottle and will say unfiltered. That's a closer quality to a vintage. Okay, you can keep it a few more years. It will keep on growing in the bottle because it has all the elements that we talked about earlier, and therefore it's a sort of like a poor man's vintage port, which I love. LBVs, okay? They're very approachable, ready to drink now. In contrast to a vintage port where you would have to, so let's say we have a 2016 here today, you would start drinking that bottle to enjoy in 2026 onwards, whilst an LBV, ready to drink, pour now and drink now and enjoy its freshness. Right, crusted. Crusted is a term that not many people can understand. I will explain, because all of the previous ones, the vintage comes from a single year. The late bottle vintage comes from a single year. The single Quinta vintage port comes from a single year. The crusted, though, is a blend of various years. Okay, port is as much about blending as it is about extraction, as it is about maturation, because what you do, you blend varieties, you blend years, you blend, so that's what a crusted is. Crusted is really close to a vintage port. Again, the name came out because of the actual crust or the sediment that you'll find in the bottle. Again, this port is unfiltered, okay? And there is a date on the bottle, normally uncrusted, so you'll probably see Graham's 2002 crusted port, for instance. When it says 2002, it does not refer to the year of harvest, okay? It refers to the year of bottling. Okay, and it says in little letters, bottled in 2002. Okay, these can be released as soon as possible from a winemaker. They'll follow the same technique as the vintage port winemaking. Okay, a couple of years in a very big barrel, okay, not much oxidation sort of thing to incorporate all the flavors and the blending techniques. And then they will release it to the market. Or the winemaker may choose to keep it bottle it and keep it in its cellars for a few more years, in which case he has to say on the label bottle matured, that he has matured it before released on the market. And that is a crusted, okay, a blend of different vintages, okay, that's made very similar to a vintage port. It's actually reaching, in terms of quality, quite close to a vintage port at a fraction of a price.
Thank you so much, Dia. I wouldn't wish for anybody else to have started off this series, and I think this episode truly lays the foundation for everything to follow. Do please check below for Dia's website and main social media handles as The Wine Mojo. And if you'd like to tell a friend about this particular episode, just send them to interpretingwine.com/portintro19. And next time on the podcast, in episode 351, we go inside the glass with Dia as she leads a tasting of 6 ports that represent the style. See you then.